Hi, I'm Dean Bushmiller. This is Cybersecurity Acquisitions Process. Use or consumption of this material by AI is expressly forbidden. So let's get started. Cybersecurity acquisition process. We've talked about this before. We have. We've talked about, we've talked about intellectual property. We've talked about the supply chain and supply chain risk management. And now we're taking this and changing it around and looking at it a very different way. So if you look inside of here, when we talk about the concepts of this, we have to figure out how these things kind of intersect. What's going on here? So let's zoom into how these things intersect. First off, from a technology standpoint, that's the first thing that we need to know about. Underneath of that, we're cybersecurity people, and we're talking about that cybersecurity. So we got to know technology and cybersecurity to begin with. Then that intersects with the contracts for purchasing these things, for acquiring these things. And then inside of those contracts, we may have intellectual property law that we have to deal with. The last thing that intersects all of these things is capital expenditures or operational expenditures. So we're going to take all of that stuff together. We're going to bring it all together, and we're going to prevent vendor lock-in, and we're going to reduce unexpected operating overhead before we sign any contract with any vendors that are out there. So what we get out of this is we evaluate the real cost of security tools by mapping the technical features directly to the contract obligations that we have. Let's talk about procurement policies. And you go, well, Dean, this is kind of boring at this point. But no, what this does is this eliminates compliance gaps by hard-coding product security frameworks into your vendor vetting pipeline that you're putting in place. We're going to incorporate standardized, legally binding contractual clauses. We need to know the standards of that. I'll talk about the toll-in a second. We're going to identify and document obligations to external authorities and third parties. The people in our own organization that we need to interact with, and we need to realize that sometimes the vendor is going to give us something that doesn't satisfy the internal needs, and we've got to go back and manage, the expectations of the organization around things like security, privacy, and maybe even cryptographic third-party issues that we have. Like, for instance, in PCI, we're required to do TLS 1.3 as of 2026. And so if you go to buy a product and it's not TLS 1.3 capable, you can't say, well, we're going to go ahead and get an exception for it. I mean, you could, but you really shouldn't be. What we need to do is we need to demand that the vendor security fits our regulatory frameworks. What are the must for a vendor inside of here? Well, they must maintain software dependencies list. They must tell us that, hey, when you install this software, it's going to need these things and these tools. That might be as simple, especially with software as a service, as a browser. I know I work with one company right now, and they say, when you're doing presenting, Dean, we only want you to use the Chrome browser. I'm like, but I like, no. This is what we use. This is the standard, and we want you to follow it. Okay, that's fine, because their software internally depends on making sure that that browser is in place. We're going to coordinate vulnerability disclosure policies with the organization. If I'm buying from you and you have a software vulnerability, I don't want to read about it in the press later on. I want to know about it before everybody else does, so that I can take some sort of action internally. Even if you don't have a patch, tell me, hey, you know what? You got to turn that thing off. They should also provide timely security updates within that entire process. Let's talk about the structured cyclical process. We're going to establish an end-to-end repeatable framework for auditing software before, during, and after operational use. So that looks like the interrelated security steps. What we're really talking about here is the SDLC. We're going to talk later on about all the different steps and all the different components that are in there, but the ones, if you ran screaming from the room at this moment in time, that you have to pay attention to are, well, starting off with initiation, because that's where the acquisition process starts off. But there's all these little pieces that once we write the contracts, we want to make sure all that stuff happens. So therefore, we're going to need to integrate as we go along. We're going to look at all the different components there. Lastly, again, if you forget everything else, disposal. Sometimes when you purchase from an organization and you say, we don't want to use this software anymore, there's an early termination clause that may favor them, the seller, or you, the buyer at that point. When we talk about cyclical refinement, we want to keep procurement specifications accurate, thorough, and iterative, and make sure that that fits our technical risk assessments. So the steps are interrelated and build on each other as we're going along, and we need to address the system as the concepts are refined, because I don't know about you, but when I get a piece of software, especially from a vendor, I can't just take it out of the box, plug it in, and it works perfectly for my environment. I need to adjust it for my environment. This is especially true if I'm building, well, if they're building software for me specifically. It needs to address the system concepts that are working for me. We need some sort of tool in here, and I wanted to talk about a contracts handbook by Tolan. I think it's an incredible thing. What it does for us, it gives us structured, clear service level agreements, maintenance requirements, and some sort of transition assistance rules with the vendors that we're dealing with. Inside of Tolan, which I really like the book, and you should read it if you have to deal with contracts on a regular basis, are the contract clauses. Those contract clauses break down into kind of 3 different sets here: prime, general, and boilerplate. For the prime, this is the place where we do have to focus a lot of our attention, and these are the contracts that we're going to read a lot as security professionals, making sure that that contract does what we need it to do. So what kind of contracts can we integrate with? Well, the licensing contracts that we get, like the end user agreement or the software licensing that we have. What are we allowed to do with the software? What are we not allowed to do with it? That's different from subscriptions for cloud services. For instance, for me, for penetration testing, if I install software on a workstation and I penetrate that workstation, if I'm doing testing against that workstation, I'm allowed to do it because it's on my property. But if I was doing something from one of the big vendors out there that software as a service, they're probably not going to let me do penetration testing against that particular piece of software because it may affect others. So we have to look at those very differently from each other. And the language that is in each one of those licensing or subscription for cloud services is going to be very different. We have to treat it very differently and understand the standard clauses that are in there. There also are professional services, especially when it comes to any kind of programming that's out there. But those professional services usually are in the form of either like a maintenance contract, or maybe like you've outsourced your incident response or your disaster recovery. Those professional services contracts are going to be very different than the software contracts. What happens if there's a transfer of intellectual property ownership? The classic example here is work for hire. Right now, I work with a vendor who is helping me build my AI internal software that we use for a lot of our tools. I mean, I do programming in AI, but it's vibe coding. It's not the really good stuff. I get the really high quality stuff from somebody else. Well, now what happens? Do they own that? Can they tell somebody else? Can they go out and sell to another one of my competitors? What does that contract in the prime situation look like? Lastly, in the prime pieces of the contract, we want to talk about payment. I want to pay for what works. I don't want to, I'm sure you've heard this, there's, oh, well, that's coming in the next version. Yeah, but I don't want the promise of the next version. I'm paying for this version to work. Don't tell me what's coming later on and say that that's the great way to do things. And, oh, I'm selling that you can't have right now, but you have to pay for this. No, I'm not doing any of that. I'm not buying into any of that stuff that's out there. So let's move on to talking about generally the general clauses that we have. There's a big, huge list of these, and let's zoom out and take a look at the entire list here. This is where, by the way, this is where Tolan is really good, talking about each one of the general things that you have to put in place. Take a look at this list and see that there's so many things on there like non-disclosure, non-compete, dispute resolution, all of these different things inside of here. These are the key clauses that are in every contract if you're managing the contracts for your organization. Now, there's a bunch of junk inside of there that we call boilerplate. You can't skip it in cybersecurity. Why? Well, definitions, okay, I get what's the definition of who owns this property. Independent contractors, what do they have as a responsibility? How about this one? Suppose the software is purchased in, like, say I live in Texas, and I want to fight somebody and they sell the software and they're based out of California. Do I have to get on a plane, hire an attorney in the state of California that's bar associate in the state of California? Or can we do this over in Texas? Also, technology exports cause some real problems, especially when it comes to heavy-duty encryption for our organization with the rules of being able to transfer that technology. So technology exports for our enterprise. Let's say we're buying firewalls and VPNs in the United States and we have a new division in another country, and that country doesn't allow super hard VPNs and IPsec. We've got a technology export issue that we have to deal with within our contract. We may have to go back to the vendor and say, hey, we can't have that level of firewall. Can we have a lower level of firewall or a lower level VPN? And they'll go, sure, for extra money because you didn't include that in your contract. So we've got to be thinking about some of that boilerplate language that may have to change in these cases. I want to go to an example and I want to talk about firewalls. Why? Well, because I want to avoid that predatory software as a service, auto renewal, massive subscription fee hikes with the specific negotiations and fixes. I want to eliminate a lot of that out of kind of the language that we're doing there. And so I wanted to give you an example of something that I kind of understand. And I start off with brick. So I have a couple of firewalls here that I've been using over time. One of them that I really do like. I like the Cisco Meraki even before it was Cisco. I like this, but this thing, it's a brick. Why? Because it's broken? No, I can plug it in and it'll work and packets will flow across it, but I won't get any firewalling activity. Why? Because firewalls are different today. First off, the hardware, we buy that. Second off, this requires a software as a service, software subscription for it to run. So I've got to look at this from a cost standpoint. What's the total cost of ownership included on this? Well, there's a couple of different things that we have to deal with. First, let's look at it from a risk standpoint. Software subscription lapses mean this is going to be turned into a brick. The implication of that is that now what we're doing is we have a subscription to a utility service. See, it's different. And management's going to have to understand that there's a subscription that goes along with this. Let's say that all of a sudden in the middle of the contract, 2 or 3 years in, management says, you know what, we can't afford to pay for something. I'm going to cut off those subscriptions to the firewalls. I mean, we already have the physical firewalls. We don't have to worry about it, right? No, these stop functioning at that point. So what we're doing is we're calculating the total cost of ownership to include that subscription service. I know when I buy these, by the way, this is just one of the tricks of the trade. I know when I buy these, I buy them with a 5-year license. I could buy them with a 1, a 3, a 5, and sometimes you can even buy them if they're at the very beginning of their life. You can buy them with like a 7-year, a 7-year subscription. I buy it to match up to what this device will have as its total life, its total cost of ownership, and I make those two things line up so that at the end of the 5 years, I can go, yep, this is a brick. I'm not going to use that anymore. Let's talk about some of the traps that we're going to run into with like purchasing tools that are out there, firewalls in particular as the example here. So I've talked about software as a service there. What can the problems be around software as a service? Well, we'll start off with price caps. You have to set price caps or at least realize that there are going to be some extensions to this. Some organizations can raise their subscription fees up to 15% every year, year over year. And so now you got to calculate that in your total cost of ownership. I don't really like that. Or how about auto renewals? Have you ever had auto renewals that you didn't want to sign up for? And they have these opt-out timelines that are really, really narrow. You have to make sure that you do this, or if you do it a day late, we're going to go ahead and charge you a lot. And by the way, I really do like the way that Cisco and Meraki have set things up so that if I make a mistake, I can actually roll back that license in a lot of cases. So I like that tool. But let's talk about the general fixes for software as a service that you want to have in place for price caps and auto renewals. First off, if you have enough purchasing power, you can set up a negotiated not to exceed percentage. Maybe it's 3% annually or something like that. Set that up in advance. That's a point of negotiation. When you get over, I think around $100,000 is when you can actually start negotiating that. Usually it's around $1 million. The other one for the auto renewals, you want explicitly in writing the notification required sometime before, 30 to 90 days before the actual automatic renewal kicks in. And one of the products that I get a couple of my smaller customers to use actually has one of these pieces in it. This is for software as a service, application layer firewall for a product called WordFence. It's for some software that's out there. You should take a look at this. And this is WordPress software, but WordFence is a software as a service application firewall, and they send this 30 days beforehand. I can't negotiate this contract. But again, large purchases or larger long-term contracts where you have some purchasing power, you can actually you can put this stuff in place if you want to. But I like the way that they do it, and I use this as the template when I go to others and I say, hey, look, you're a big giant company. This is a little tiny company. Why can't you give us favorable clauses like they do? Cloud telemetry is another problem that we may run into, especially today with firewalls, because this device, and this device actually does this, sends metadata and data to vendors for analysis. It's required. Like in this case, this is for advanced malware protection for the Meraki, and it says right there very clearly that they're going to send telemetry data up and they're going to deliver signatures down to me. And I have to be prepared for that if I'm clicking on enable there. So next thing we need to talk about here with cloud telemetry is the compliance issue that we run into. Is your business a highly regulated business, or does it have highly regulated data in it? You're required to know where, like if we have this and it sends out to the cloud, where that data is being sent and where it's being stored. For a large multinational like Cisco, you can say, hey, I want this stored in this country. But sometimes you might purchase from another vendor who has their headquarters in another country that doesn't have favorable extradition of your data, or they may use it inappropriately. So if you've got a compliance issue, you really have to look at that exporting of the data. That requires a deep understanding and integration with the software, or at least learning about it as you're implementing it. So what are the fixes for cloud telemetry? Well, you're going to figure out that you have a data processing agreement, and it has to define things like data ownership, anonymity, and maybe even regional sovereignty that you could be exposed to. Be looking for those clauses in your contracts. Next, when it comes to our firewalls, is the end of life and end of service. Remember, this hardware, well, it lasts a long time. Today's hardware is much more robust than, like, say, 10 or 15 years ago. But we run into this thing called end of life. The vendor might go out of that line of business. That actually happened with me, and I'm talking about Cisco again. They have this really cool tool for Meraki called the Systems Manager, which allowed me to manage mobile devices. It was mobile device management as an offshoot, as a branch of the device itself. So any devices that came into that particular office. We could say, oh, you're not part of our mobile device management, so we'll give you this VLAN, that's like NAC, network access control. Or when you came in and you were a part of our network and you had registered on our network, we could deliver patches and updates to you. We could deliver software to you if you wanted to in certain cases. That systems manager had an end of service as of June 2026. I'm recording this around June 2026. And I have a customer out there that has a lot of this in place, and we've got 3 years before we have to get off of this service, because there's going to be an end of device support, or the licensing support for this. So we have to get off of that. What happens is a lot of vendors will come along and go, here's an alternative. This is your alternative that you can choose. Well, thank you very much, but I've got to go back into that customer and I've got to say, your business process is going to change here, here, and here. You don't have a single integrated panel right here. That isn't available. By the way, it is available from Rocky. They'll allow you to add applications into that dashboard. But the problem is that I've got to go through that contracting process with that other organization. I've got to look up their licensing and all that stuff. What's the fix for the end of life and end of service? Align the contract terms. The example that I gave you was if you're going to buy a firewall, buy a 5-year license that fits with it. Make sure that those are congruent so that at the end, what we can say is, it's been 5 years, we've been using this. We want to go ahead and do we want to extend its life, or do we want to upgrade to the next level of services? I found with the devices that I use that usually our bandwidth consumption and our demand at about 5 years is about the right time. Sometimes it's 3 years, but around 5 years, we've outlived the usefulness, the throughput for that particular firewall, and we need to upgrade to the next level of throughput there. So it usually fits with the contract terms. What this also means is that you're going to have to, and this is the painful part, build and test alternative support avenues for all of your critical cybersecurity process. You're going to have to define what's critical. You're going to have to define how you do things, who's working on those things, what are the roles and responsibilities, all of that stuff, and say, if this went away tomorrow, what would we do next? Last piece that I want to talk about here as an example is the service level agreements and the liability. These are two separate things, but I put them in the same place because that's kind of where they fit inside of your contract. What happens if your firewall catches fire? Oh, when's your replacement going to come in the mail? So what we're talking about is hardware replacement. Usually you'll have an RMA that you have to deal with. You have to call people. You have to explain that you need this thing. Is it going to get to you in 4 hours, the next day, or the next week? Or is the supply chain for delivering that kind of, fallen away because of embargoes or whatever it is that's happening today? There's also the liability gap. Well, the vendor says, hey, you know what? We have a limited liability clause. The limited liability clause is up to the value, usually if it's a piece of hardware like a firewall, up to the value of the piece of hardware and maybe even the portion of the software contract that has not expired. And that's the limit of their liability in a lot of cases. By the way, I love the ones in software as a service where they say, if our product isn't working, we won't charge you. Isn't that nice that they won't charge you at that point? That's the limit of their liability. Meantime, I'm out of business. I've got to go somewhere else. The reality is, for the liability gaps, in order for you to negotiate these things, there's really no fixes for this unless you're spending more than $1 million, euros, pounds per year. So there's no fix for that piece. Let's talk about the other fix for the firewall catching fire, if you will. The fix here is, first off, read your contract and know that it matches your internal SLA. If it's going to be a week before you get a replacement for this device, you can say, we are going to be down for a full week, and you put that into your policy. Management goes, wait a minute, we can't be down for a week. You go, well, the vendor that we've purchased from and the licensing agreement that we have and the support contract that we purchased with this dictate that we only get a replacement. Oh, well, let's go from Let's go from silver to gold or to platinum or to diamond so we can get 4-hour response time. Okay, so we can be down for 4 hours. Oh, wait a minute, we can't do that. Okay, then let's get 2 of these firewalls, couple them together, and then we can have a failover, and if one of them blows out, then we can go get a replacement almost automatically, and there won't be any downtime whatsoever. Oh, but see, we've got to pay for another hardware. Maybe even sometimes we have to pay for a secondary licensing, but it has to match your internal service level agreement. Or you could do the duplicate hardware, which is what most people do. Along with this, and the last thing that I want to leave you with as this example is practicing your recovery process. For me, I have on speed dial Meraki so that I can call them up and say, here's my contract number, here's all my stuff, and I need another firewall and I need it delivered. And they're pretty good about it. I mean, usually 2 days, but I also have duplicate firewalls, so I fail over, so I practice all of that stuff to make sure that I've got my contract in place, that I've got my physical hardware in place, and that I can have some form of failover within my organization. Those are the basics of all of this acquisition stuff. I want to talk about AI here. And I want to talk about protecting your organization from the liability risk caused by hallucinations or unauthorized AI agents. Let's take a really good example. This is Moffat v. Air Canada in 2024. They had a hallucinating chatbot. So what happened was Moffat said, hey, I want to go to the chatbot and I want to ask about bereavement fares. And so Jake asked this question. And the response back was the chatbot said, hey, you can book this a ticket immediately right now and apply for a partial refund within 90 days. And Air Canada, their official policy strictly forbids retroactive applications. Are you Jake or are you Air Canada? In both cases, the customer didn't get what they want and the vendor didn't supply, there's a problem here between the two of them. Somebody's going to be angry. So what we do is we go to court. And Air Canada argued. They said, this chatbot's a separate entity defense. That was their claim there. It was a separate entity. It claimed that the chatbot was a separate legal entity. The ruling from the court was, yeah, no, okay? You bought that website chatbot or you hired somebody to build that. That's a tool of the corporation. You will honor this. And then they run back in and quickly reprogram the chatbot and make sure that it doesn't do these things again. Also, you're going to have to, not only are you going to have to deal with hallucinations, but you're going to have to deal with customers who know how to game the system. Maybe they're doing some sort of injection into that to get it to respond in a certain way, to go ahead and give them a lower fare. You're going to have to be careful with those AI chatbots because the liability is on you. This is just Canada, and you may not have regulations that are on top of you. You may not be a part of the Canadian provenances, but still those litigations are going to come up. Here's the thing that's happening right now for AI. AI is fundamentally breaking contract doctrines in 3 very specific ways. First, there's the collapse of notice and choice. This is kind of falling apart at this point. Hang in there with me. Internet contracts used to rely on this thing called click wrap agreements. You check the box to agree to the terms, and those terms were spelled out very specifically. But now what we're doing is we're creating these large language model interfaces that dynamically generate customer responses. And it may say, here are our terms of service, right? And it might hallucinate some of that stuff. So the AI is negotiating or offering terms dynamically. And it's impossible for the corporation to provide what they call advance notice, that contract beforehand, of what the AI is going to say. So what we do is we don't have, in contract law, it's called the meeting of the minds between the 2 human entities, because one of them's not a human. One of them's a large language model. One of them is a token spitter at that point. So that's kind of eroding at this point. Next is what's called the risky agent without intention. The risky agent. So law normally holds a principle that it may be your company and you have a human agent, somebody picking up the phone and picking up that phone and answering. They hold that agent responsible because they can be supervised by somebody in the organization and they've been trained by somebody in the organization. You really can't supervise an AI real-time semantic output. It's just not possible at this point. So the companies claim they should not be bound by the unexpected promise their system generates. That breaks that thing and it's blowing it apart. The last one is what's called the defense of unforeseeable glitches. This is where everybody is very unhappy. So commercial contract disputes involve automated supply chain and procurement software. So supply chain and procurement software is now having large language models and agents working on behalf of it. I talked about this in a couple of other discussions before. See, the AI is going to look at the inventory or the projection of inventory, especially like just-in-time inventory, and calculate those needs, but it may screw that up. The corporate defendant argues that the action was an unexecutable system failure. I didn't really want 1 million rolls of toilet paper for my office in the city of Des Moines. We didn't really need a million rolls of toilet paper to go ahead and sell at that office. And this is where it gets into, it's not legally a binding breach there because it would not be expected. It's unreasonable for that to happen. The problem is what they do is they say, okay, well, this is all automated between your agent ordering and my agent fulfilling this, and they have a match on the contract there. And by the way, a lot of the blockchain is helping facilitate these exact matches. There's no parties involved. There's no, I set it up, you set it up, and they went ahead and did that match. And, I wanted to buy 1 million rolls of toilet paper, and there's the strike price for 1 million rolls of toilet paper. Who's going to deal with this? Well, we're shoving this over into the courts, and the courts are going to get overburdened when it comes to all of this. So that is problematic for us.